Rain hammered the Belltown Grand Hotel parking lot with the kind of intensity that made Seattle natives check their weather apps and tourists reconsider their vacation choices. Water sheeted across asphalt turned mirror slick, reflecting sodium lights, and the occasional headlight sweep from cars navigating the maze of luxury vehicles parked at angles that suggested their drivers had money but not necessarily spatial awareness. Garrett Sullivan tightened the final bolt on the catering company's alternator fingers. Black with grease that 3 years of operating a mobile mechanic business had made as permanent as the tattoo on his forearm and considerably more difficult to explain at parent-teacher conferences. The alternator replacement had taken 40 minutes instead of the hour he'd quoted, which meant two things. First, that his estimate had been conservative enough to avoid the customer complaints that killed small businesses, and second, that he might actually make it home before Bryn fell asleep. His 13-year-old daughter still waited up when he worked late, despite Mrs. Kowalski's best efforts to enforce reasonable bedtimes. Still needed to see his face in the doorway before she could close her eyes and trust that morning would come with her father still in it. 3 years since Olivia died, and Bryn still carried that fear like a stone in her pocket, worn smooth by constant handling but never quite light enough to forget. Garrett wiped his hands on a shop rag that had long ago given up any pretense of actually cleaning anything, cataloging the tools he'd need to stow before the drive home. Socket wrench multimeter, the headlamp he'd been using because the parking lot lighting was designed by someone who'd never actually worked on a vehicle after dark. The customer nervous guy in his mid-20s who'd been hired to manage logistics for some tech company's holiday party hovered nearby, with the particular anxiety of someone whose job depended on vehicles running on schedule. "You're sure it'll hold?" The question came for the third time, pitched higher with each iteration. "Because if the van breaks down tomorrow during service, my boss will literally kill me. Not figuratively. She's made threats that I think might actually be legally binding." Garrett straightened, felt his back protest the hour spent bent over an engine compartment, and met the kid's eyes with the patient expression he'd perfected through years of dealing with customers who didn't understand that mechanical repair was as much art as science. "It'll hold. New alternator OEM part. Not aftermarket garbage, installed correctly with proper tension on the belt. You're good for another 80,000 miles minimum, assuming you keep up with regular maintenance like oil changes and not driving through floods." The kid nodded, relieved, and pulled out his phone to process payment through the app that Garrett had finally reluctantly adopted after Bryn had pointed out that refusing credit cards in 2025 was like Super Boomer Dad and also bad for business. The transaction went through with a cheerful ping that still felt wrong somehow, like money should involve more ceremony than radio waves and encrypted data. "Thanks, man. Seriously, you saved my ass." The kid climbed into the van, started the engine that now purred instead of grinding, and pulled out of the parking lot with the careful deliberation of someone acutely aware that their employment hung on mechanical reliability. Garrett watched him go, then turned his attention to packing his tools with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned that lost equipment meant lost income. The rain had picked up, transitioning from merely unpleasant to actively hostile, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that felt personal. He was reaching for the toolbox when the sound cut through the storm's white noise, a gasp, raw and desperate. The particular timbre that came from deep in the chest where pain lived unfiltered by social convention, or the instinct to appear fine. He'd heard that sound before. In Fallujah, when shrapnel found soft tissue and 18-year-olds learned that armor stopped bullets, but not the universe's indifference to human fragility. In Kandahar, when IEDs turned transport vehicles into mass casualty events and screaming became the only language that mattered. And 3 years ago in St. Catherine Hospital's waiting room when Olivia coded and the world stopped making promises it had no intention of keeping. Garrett's hands froze on the wrench he'd been about to stow. His combat medic training kicked in with the automaticity of muscle memory: assess, approach, analyze, act. The sequence had been drilled into him across 3 tours and countless casualties until it became something deeper than conscious thought. Something that happened in the space between stimulus and response, where instinct lived, 30 feet away through sheets of rain that blurred the boundaries between solid and liquid. A woman in an evening gown leaned against a Tesla Model S, both hands clutching her abdomen like she could hold her insides together through sheer force of will. The dress was expensive. Garrett knew fabric quality the way mechanics knew engine sounds from years of seeing what people wore when they brought their cars in for service. Her blonde hair hung in wet ropes across her face, and even from this distance, he could see the particular shade of pale that combat medics learned to recognize as the body's white flag surrender negotiations happening at a cellular level, while consciousness still insisted everything was manageable. She was breathing wrong. Too shallow, too fast, the kind of respiration pattern that said oxygen wasn't reaching tissue that desperately needed it. Her posture screamed guarding behavior, the instinctive curl of someone protecting damaged organs from further injury. And the way she leaned against the car wasn't casual fatigue, but the desperate lean of someone whose legs had stopped being reliable and standing upright had become negotiable. Garrett crossed the distance without making a conscious decision to move, boots splashing through puddles that reflected city lights in fractured patterns. He was already cataloging symptoms with the cold efficiency of triage diaphoresis, evident in the sheen of sweat mixing with rain on her face, guarding posture, protecting what his training identified as right. Lower quadrant skin color suggesting vasoconstriction and possible shock tachycardia visible in the rapid pulse at her throat, where her carotid artery jumped against skin gone translucent with stress. His hand touched her shoulder, gentle but firm enough to register through whatever fog of pain she was navigating. The contact was professional, automatic, the touch of someone who'd spent years learning exactly where to put hands on strangers in crisis. Her eyes snapped to his with the speed of a startled animal, blue and hard as winter ice over deep water, carrying the particular fury of someone who'd built their entire existence around never needing help and deeply resented the universe for making a liar of them. "I don't need help from..." She stopped mid-sentence, swallowed hard against what might have been pain, or might have been pride, or might have been both, competing for dominance. When she tried again, each word cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. "I'm fine. I just need a minute to catch my breath, and then I'll be perfectly capable of managing this situation on my own." Garrett recognized the lie because he'd lived a nearly identical version 3 years ago. Olivia had said her stomach hurt, and he'd handed her Advil and a glass of water and chosen to believe that love meant respecting her assessment of her own body. That choice had put his wife in the ground at Evergreen Cemetery and his daughter in therapy sessions that insurance barely covered, and him in a category of guilt that didn't have a proper name because the English language hadn't invented words for that particular flavor of failure. He'd sworn on Olivia's grave, standing in rain that felt exactly like tonight's rain, while Bryn held his hand and asked questions he couldn't answer without lying that he would never make that mistake again. Never let politeness or respect for autonomy or fear of overstepping social boundaries kill someone he could save. Without asking permission, without giving her the choice to refuse, he took her wrist between his thumb and 2 fingers. Her pulse hammered against his touch, rapid, thready, the kind of rhythm that said the cardiovascular system was throwing everything it had at a problem that required surgical intervention, not increased heart rate. When he pressed gently on her right side, just below the ribs where anatomy placed the appendix when it wasn't busy trying to kill its host, she flinched hard enough to draw blood from her lip where teeth clamped down to prevent the scream that wanted to escape. The diagnosis crystallized in his mind with the certainty of facts that don't negotiate. Appendicitis, probably advanced based on the severity of her reaction to palpation and the timeline he was constructing from context clues in presentation. Possibly already ruptured, though he hoped not, because ruptured meant septic shock, and septic shock meant the kind of cascade failure that turned routine emergencies into preventable deaths. The same goddamn thing that had killed Olivia Sullivan while Garrett sat in a waiting room convincing himself that doctors knew what they were doing and his wife would be fine because she had to be fine because the alternative was unthinkable right up until the moment it became historical fact. A woman in a business suit burst from the hotel entrance like she'd been fired from a cannon phone already pressed to her ear, high heels clicking an urgent rhythm on wet pavement. Behind her came a security guard, thick-necked and officious, wearing the expression of someone whose job description included removing problems and who'd already categorized Garrett's oil-stained work uniform in the way he dared to touch someone several tax brackets above his pay grade as exactly that kind of problem. "I'm calling 911 right now," the suited woman announced to everyone in no one voice, climbing octaves as she spoke to emergency dispatch. "Yes, I need an ambulance at the Belltown Grand Hotel. No, the one downtown, parking lot behind the building. My employer is experiencing severe abdominal pain and I think she needs immediate medical attention. But she's refusing to acknowledge the severity and I don't know what to do because she's my boss and I can't exactly force her, but she looks really bad and what? How long? 38 to 42 minutes, but you don't understand, she really needs 38 to 42 minutes for an ambulance to navigate downtown Seattle traffic on a night when some stadium or arena or concert venue had just disgorged thousands of people into streets that couldn't handle normal rush hour without becoming parking lots. Garrett did the math with the cold precision of someone who'd done similar calculations while watching people bleed out in the back of transport vehicles on roads that led to field hospitals that were never quite close enough to matter. 42 minutes. Olivia had coded in 40 minutes flat, her appendix rupturing while nurses took her blood pressure for the third time and asked her to rate her pain on a scale from 1 to 10. As if subjective numerical assessment meant anything when biology was in the process of catastrophic failure. The security guard stepped between Garrett and the woman, one meaty hand held up in the universal gesture of "Stop right there and don't make me make this physical." His name tag read Rico, and his eyes held the particular contempt that men in uniform sometimes developed for men who worked with their hands and wore that work on their clothes like evidence of insufficient ambition. "Sir, you need to step back right now. This is private property and you need to leave before I'm forced to call the police and have you removed for trespassing and possibly assault, given that you put your hands on this woman without her explicit consent." Garrett didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on the woman who'd begun to shake, not from cold, despite the rain, but from the body's rebellion against pain it couldn't process, couldn't categorize, couldn't ignore, no matter how much conscious will insisted that acknowledging weakness was unacceptable. He'd seen that shake before, in soldiers who'd been shot and didn't want to admit it because admitting vulnerability felt like failure. In his wife, when she'd finally agreed to go to the hospital but kept insisting she could walk to the car under her own power because asking for help felt like surrender. She has maybe an hour before her appendix ruptures if it hasn't already. Garrett kept his voice level professional, the tone he'd used when delivering bad news to commanding officers who didn't want to hear it, but needed to anyway. Based on presentation and symptom timeline, probably less. 42 minutes for an ambulance means she's either dead or in septic shock before they even get her loaded. I can have her at St. Catherine Hospital in 8 minutes if traffic cooperates, 6 if it doesn't. And I'm willing to run lights that look safe to run. The guard's hand moved toward his radio with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd practiced the gesture for intimidation effect. "How would you possibly know any of that? You some kind of doctor who makes house calls in parking lots." "Army Combat Medic 68 Whiskey, which is the military occupational specialty code for healthcare specialist if you're not familiar with Army terminology. 3 tours across Iraq and Afghanistan between 2006 and 2014. Which means I've seen more traumatic injuries and acute medical emergencies than most ER doctors see in their entire careers. And because my wife died 3 years ago saying exactly what this woman is saying right now, and I made the catastrophically stupid mistake of believing her when she said she was fine and just needed rest." The words came out flat effect, stripped away by 3 years of practice at saying them without falling apart in front of strangers who didn't need to witness his breakdown. The woman's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in the armor of certainty that had insisted she could handle this situation through willpower alone. Her voice cut through the standoff, weak but still carrying the kind of authority that came from years of expecting obedience and generally receiving it. "I said I'm not going to a hospital. Both of you need to leave me alone so I can sit down for a minute. This is just stress. I've been working too hard. I skipped lunch. Maybe dinner too, I don't remember. It's nothing serious. Hospitals are for sick people and I'm not sick. The world tilted sideways. Garrett heard Olivia's voice speaking nearly identical words with the same stubborn certainty that willpower could substitute for medical intervention. She'd been so convinced she knew her own body, so sure that doctors were for other people. People who were actually ill rather than just uncomfortable. He'd listened to her because he'd loved her, and he'd thought that love meant respecting her choices even when those choices terrified him. That respect had made their daughter motherless and him a widower at 34, and he'd learned exactly what respecting the wrong choices at the wrong time cost when you tallied up the bill 3 years later. His hands moved before his brain had fully authorized the action, rolling up the sleeve of his work shirt with practiced efficiency. The tattoo stood stark against his forearm, a wedding ring rendered in black ink, because he couldn't stand to wear the actual ring anymore, but couldn't stand to pretend the marriage hadn't mattered. February 14th, 2010, the date he'd promised to love Olivia Sullivan in sickness and in health until death did them part. December 8th, 2022. The date death had collected on that contract. Below the dates running parallel to the wedding ring design, a scar 4 inches long and still angry-looking even 3 years after the fact. Permanent evidence of the night he'd tried to break down the emergency room door to reach his wife while security held him back. And doctors called codes he didn't understand then but understood perfectly now. My wife said exactly what you just said. His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by 3 years of saying these words to his daughter and his therapist and the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come and memory wouldn't leave. She told me she was fine, that she just needed a minute to rest. That hospitals were for sick people and she wasn't sick, just tired, just stressed from work and life and raising a daughter and being married to a man who'd come back from war different than he'd left. I believed her because I loved her, and I thought being a good husband meant respecting her autonomy even when every instinct I had was screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. The woman stared at the scar and something shifted in her face, recognition of pain that matched her own. Or maybe just the dawning realization that the stranger in the oil-stained uniform standing in the rain might actually know what he was talking about instead of being some random person with an overinflated sense of medical knowledge. She died in the waiting room 40 minutes after I finally convinced her to let me bring her to the hospital. This scar is from when I tried to break down the door to the operating room because security wouldn't let me through, and I thought if I could just get to her, if I could just make them understand how serious it was, if I could just... He stopped himself. Swallowed the rest of the sentence because some things hurt too much to say out loud. Even 3 years later. Even to strangers who were experiencing their own medical emergencies. The point is, she died because we waited. Because she was scared of hospitals and I was too scared of upsetting her to override that fear. And I have to live with that knowledge every single day. I have to explain to my 13-year-old daughter why her mother isn't coming home. I have to stand at a grave and apologize to a corpse for being weak when strength mattered. The assistant page, he'd heard her call herself when speaking to dispatch, put a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with the particular horror of watching someone else's tragedy unfold in real time and understanding that it might be prophetic rather than merely historical. Rico's radio hung forgotten at his belt, his officious demeanor cracking under the weight of genuine human suffering being laid bare in a parking lot that smelled like rain and oil and desperation. The woman leaned harder against the Tesla, and Garrett watched her face cycle through expressions he recognized from mirrors and therapy sessions and the endless late nights when Bryn asked questions he didn't know how to answer without either lying or traumatizing her further. Denial gave way to anger, gave way to fear, gave way to the first creeping edge of terror that whispered maybe, just maybe this time. The fear of hospitals was more dangerous than whatever the hospital might do to you. Thunder rolled overhead like artillery in the distance, and somewhere in the city sirens wailed, probably heading to the multi-vehicle accident on I-5 that meant no emergency services were coming to this parking lot anytime soon. Garrett pulled his phone from his pocket, checked the map application with hands that had started shaking from adrenaline or memory or both, did the mental math that separated living from dying. St. Catherine Hospital is 8 minutes from here if I take the industrial district route and don't stop for yellow lights that I can reasonably run without causing additional emergencies. I can get you there before an ambulance even makes it out of whatever garage they're dispatched from, and every minute we spend arguing about autonomy and proper procedure is 1 minute closer to your appendix rupturing and killing you. He met her eyes, let her see everything he'd lost and everything he'd learned from losing it, all the ways that being too late had rewritten his life into something unrecognizable. Or you can wait here and hope 42 minutes is fast enough. Your call to make. But if you make the same choice my wife made, you're making it with full knowledge of exactly how that story ends when you prioritize fear over survival. The silence that followed was filled only by rain hammering pavement and distant traffic, and the sound of the woman's breathing getting progressively more labored with each passing second. Paige moved closer to her employer, close enough to catch her if she fell close enough to try to do something, even if that something was ultimately inadequate against biology in failure mode. The woman's gaze flickered from Garrett's face to his forearm, where the tattoo told stories about love and loss and the terrible price of arriving too late, then to the hospital lights visible in the distance through rain and darkness, then back to Garrett's face, as if looking at him long enough might provide the answer she was searching for. When she spoke, her voice had changed, smaller, younger, stripped of whatever armor money and success had built around her vulnerable parts. What if I go in there and I don't come out? What if walking through those doors means I die there like my... She stopped herself, but Garrett heard the unfinished sentence anyway. Because he'd spent 3 years hearing similar incomplete thoughts from his daughter, who'd learned that some endings didn't need stating because everyone already knew how they concluded. Garrett thought of Bryn waiting at home, thought of the drawing she'd made last week showing his van with improbable angel wings and the words, "Daddy fixes everything," in crayon that had smudged when she cried over math homework that felt overwhelming. Thought of all the ways he'd failed Olivia, but maybe, just maybe, didn't have to fail this stranger, who was looking at him with the same fear his wife had worn in those final hours. Then at least you tried. At least you fought. At least you gave yourself a chance instead of dying in a parking lot, because fear convinced you that giving up was safer than trying. The words came out softer now, gentler, the voice he used when Bryn woke from nightmares about losing him too and needed reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. My wife never got that chance because I was too afraid to take it for her. Because I respected her choice to avoid hospitals right up until the moment that choice killed her. I can't change what happened to Olivia, but I can make absolutely certain I don't stand here and watch someone else die from making the same mistake. The woman nodded. The gesture barely registered as movement, just the slightest dip of her chin. That might have been agreement or might have been pain bending her forward, but Garrett took it as the only permission he was going to receive. He stepped forward, slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, and lifted her with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd carried wounded soldiers across hostile terrain and understood that speed mattered more than comfort when death was waiting to collect. She weighed nothing, or maybe he was too pumped full of adrenaline to register weight anymore. He'd carried men twice her size across miles of desert sand, while gunfire painted tracers across night sky. He'd carried his wife to the truck 3 years ago, knowing with sick certainty that he was already too late, but unable to stop trying because stopping meant accepting she was going to die, and acceptance was a bridge too far. Rico stepped forward one more time, hand raised to stop him. Garrett looked at the security guard with the flat calm that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. You can call the police, you can call her lawyers, you can call whoever you want and file whatever reports make you feel like you did your job. But right now, in this exact moment, I am the only person in this parking lot who is actually keeping her alive instead of arguing about jurisdiction and liability while she dies. So get out of my way or spend the rest of your life explaining to her family why you stopped the person trying to save her." Rico stepped aside. Maybe he recognized something in Garrett's voice. The absolute conviction of someone who'd already lost this fight once and refused to lose it again. Maybe he just didn't want that particular weight on his conscience when he went home to whatever life waited for him outside this parking lot. Either way, the path to the van opened up and Garrett carried the woman across asphalt turned treacherous by rain. The van sat where he'd left it. Ford Transit 20 model with an odometer reading that advertised hard urban miles and mechanical reliability maintained through constant attention. The rear doors stood open, showing tool racks and parts bins and the complete operational history of a small business run by one man doing his best to keep food on the table and rent paid on time. The passenger seat had a flannel blanket draped over cracked vinyl upholstery. The same blanket Olivia used to wrap around herself during Seattle winters, when rain felt personal and cold seeped into bones that had grown up expecting sunshine. On the dashboard, secured with clear packing tape that had yellowed at the edges, Bryn's latest drawing dominated the available space. She'd rendered their van in red and blue crayon, added wings that spread wider than the vehicle's actual dimensions, drawn wheels that looked like flowers, or maybe stars depending on viewing angle. Above the image in the careful cursive she'd been practicing all semester, she'd written, "Daddy fixes everything," with the particular confidence of 13-year-olds, who hadn't yet learned that some things stayed broken regardless of effort applied. Garrett maneuvered the woman into the passenger seat, with gentle efficiency born from years of handling fragile things in crisis situations. He fastened the seatbelt across her chest, grabbed a clean shop towel from the bin behind the seat. One of the good ones he kept for detailing work, not the oil-stained rags used for regular maintenance. "If you need to vomit, use this towel. If the pain gets worse, squeeze my arm and tell me so I can factor that information into my driving decisions. Don't try to be brave or tough or any of that counterproductive nonsense. Just tell me what's happening so I can make choices based on facts instead of assumptions." He met her eyes, held her gaze until he was confident she'd actually heard him through whatever fog of pain and fear she was navigating. "I need you to stay conscious and talking for the next 8 minutes. Can you do that?" She nodded, clutching the shop towel like it was the only solid object in a world that had started spinning in directions physics didn't normally permit. Garrett closed the passenger door, rain streaming down his face, and rounded to the driver's side. The engine turned over with a cough and a rattle that said the alternator wasn't the only component approaching end-of-service life. But that was a problem for tomorrow or next week or whenever they both survived the next 30 minutes. Paige climbed into the back, phone still clutched in one hand, already updating someone about the change in play. Garrett caught fragments of the conversation as he pulled out of the parking lot. Something about going to St. Catherine. Something about an ambulance meeting them there. Something about lawsuits and liability that Garrett couldn't afford to care about because caring about those things meant slowing down. The van's tires hydroplaned on wet asphalt before grip found purchase through what felt like divine intervention, or blind luck. Garrett pointed the vehicle toward St. Catherine Hospital, toward the place where Olivia had died, and he hadn't entered in 3 years because every time he drove past those automatic doors he saw her face in the emergency room window and heard the sound of the flat line that had ended everything that mattered. But tonight wasn't about his fear or his trauma or the ways that building had become synonymous with failure in his mental geography. Tonight was about making sure someone else's daughter didn't grow up asking why her mother didn't come home, except the woman beside him didn't have a daughter or family or anyone waiting except employees who worked for her and an existence built around avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability. "Tell me about your business." He needed her talking, needed her conscious, needed to keep her focused on something other than pain. That was probably approaching levels where the body started considering shock as a reasonable alternative to continued awareness. "What do you do when you're not refusing medical treatment in parking lots?" The woman's eyes opened to slits, Words came out rationed like water in a desert, each syllable extracted at cost she couldn't afford. Real estate. Commercial properties specifically. I buy buildings that are failing, fix them up, sell them for profit margins that make the original owners regret their life choices. Garrett took a corner faster than wisdom or traffic laws recommended, felt the van's suspension protest in ways that would require attention he didn't have time to provide. So you take broken things and make them valuable again through applied expertise and strategic intervention. We're in the same line of work, just different scales and slightly different definitions of broken. Despite everything, despite the pain and fear and very real possibility that she might die in the next hour, she almost smiled. The expression died half-formed, killed by a spasm that made her double over as far as the seatbelt permitted, both hands pressed to her abdomen as if external pressure could maintain internal organ configurations they were trying to escape. Accept your broken things, don't argue about whether they need fixing or threaten to sue you for unauthorized repairs. You've clearly never met a 1998 Ford F-150 transmission with an attitude problem. Those things have opinions and none of them involve cooperating with the people trying to help them function properly. The laugh that escaped her sounded surprised, like she'd forgotten laughter was an option available to people experiencing medical emergencies. It died quickly, replaced by a gasp that said the pain was escalating despite conversation's best efforts at distraction. The hospital loomed ahead, red emergency room sign glowing through rain like a beacon or a warning, depending on which interpretive framework you chose. Garrett felt his chest tighten with the familiar cold sweat that accompanied PTSD, deciding to remind him why he'd avoided this particular building for 3 years. Memories crashed over him. Olivia's hand going limp in his, the doctor's expression when they'd called time of death. The sound of his own voice screaming until security dragged him out while he broke anything within reach, including parts of himself that never healed properly. 2 blocks from the hospital entrance, Garrett pulled the van to the curb and killed the engine. His hands shook on the steering wheel hard enough that the tremor was visible even in dim illumination from street lamps. The woman turned to look at him. Pain momentarily superseded by confusion or concern that the person attempting to save her life was having some kind of breakdown at exactly the worst possible moment. "What are you doing? Why are we stopping when you said 8 minutes and we're almost there?" The words came out before Garrett could stop them, before pride or shame or any other emotion that valued appearances over honesty could prevent the truth from escaping. "I can't do this. I haven't been inside St. Catherine Hospital since my wife died in that emergency room 3 years ago. I drive Bryn past this building every week on our way to school, and I never look at the doors. I avoid this entire neighborhood when alternate routes exist. I can't. I don't know if I can walk through those doors even to save you, and that makes me the worst kind of hypocrite after everything I just said about fear and choices." He stopped, pressed his palms against his eyes hard enough to generate false color in his visual field. Tried to breathe through the panic attack building in his chest like water rising in a sealed container. 3 years ago, he'd sat in the waiting room just beyond those automatic doors and done nothing productive while Olivia died 20 feet away behind barriers he couldn't cross. He'd been weak, passive, too afraid of making things worse to realize he was already experiencing the worst-case scenario. The woman's hand touched his arm, gentle, tentative, the contact of someone who didn't possess extensive experience offering comfort, but was attempting it anyway. Garrett flinched hard enough to crack his elbow against the door, but he didn't pull away. "We're both terrified right now." Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to be given her medical condition and the situation's general trajectory. "You of going in there and reliving everything that happened with your wife. Me of going in there and never coming back out, like what happened with my mother. So what do we do? How do we get past terror that has perfectly legitimate reasons for existing?" Garrett looked at the drawing taped to his dashboard. Bryn had made it last week during one of her creative fugues where external reality disappeared and only paper and crayons existed. The van with wings that would never achieve aerodynamic functionality. The words "Daddy fixes everything" written with absolute faith and competence he'd never actually possessed. Below it in smaller letters he'd only noticed this morning when early light hit the dashboard at precisely the right angle she'd added something new. Even scary things. His daughter believed in him. Believed he could fix broken things, save people, walk through doors that terrified him if the reason was sufficiently important. And tonight the reason was sitting beside him fighting for every breath, dying. Because two people were too scared to move forward into the only future that didn't end with death and regret. Garrett restarted the engine. The van shuddered to life and he eased back into traffic for the final 2 blocks that felt longer than the entire preceding drive. He pulled into the ambulance bay, technically illegal for civilian vehicles, but that was a concern for people who had spare mental capacity to worry about parking regulations. They sat in the van for what might have been 10 seconds or might have been several minutes, time losing coherent meaning the way it did when preparing to do something that terrified you. Finally, Garrett killed the engine, pocketed the keys, and walked around to the passenger side. When he opened the door, the woman looked up at him with eyes that communicated she understood exactly how much this cost. "I'm scared." The admission came out raw and unguarded, the kind of truth people usually died before speaking to strangers. Garrett unclipped her seatbelt, slid his arms underneath her, lifted her against his chest one final time. "Me too. But we're going to be braver than our fear. Both of us. Right now." He carried her toward the entrance, each step a negotiation with trauma that insisted turning around represented the only sane available option. The doors opened automatically with a pneumatic hiss, and the smell hit him with physical force, disinfectant and floor wax, and that indefinable hospital scent that smelled like institutional care delivered by exhausted people fighting entropy. His vision tunneled. Breathing became manual operation. The woman buried her face against his shoulder, both of them trembling. For 3 seconds that lasted 3 years, Garrett stood frozen between outside and inside, between past failure and present opportunity. Then he thought of Bryn's drawing and stepped through the doors into fluorescent light and antiseptic air and the organized chaos of emergency medicine in progress. The emergency room opened before Garrett like a stage set he'd memorized in nightmares, bright lights that made his eyes water after the relative darkness outside, bustling nurses in scrubs colored cheerful blues and greens as if textile choices could offset the reality of human suffering. The organized chaos of medical professionals who'd chosen careers involving other people's worst days. His voice came out stronger than he felt, loud enough to cut through ambient noise of beeping monitors and ringing phones and distant voices paging doctors to places that needed doctors immediately. "I need help. Acute abdomen, suspected appendicitis, 4+ hours, symptomatic based on presentation. Rigid abdomen, obvious guarding, rebound tenderness on examination, tachycardia estimated between 120 and 130. She needs surgical evaluation now, not after we complete intake paperwork." A nurse at the station looked up from her computer with the expression of someone transitioning from routine to emergency response mode, took one comprehensive look at Garrett's face and the woman in his arms, and grabbed a wheelchair with efficiency, suggesting this particular action had become muscle memory through repetition. The woman's hands fisted in Garrett's shirt when the nurse approached, and she shook her head with the desperation of someone drowning who'd been told to release the only flotation device available. "You promised you'd stay." Her voice had gone small and childlike, all armor stripped away to reveal the 9-year-old girl who'd watched her mother die in a place that looked and smelled and sounded exactly like this. "You said you wouldn't leave me alone in here." Garrett lowered her into the wheelchair but maintained his grip on her hand. His hold was probably uncomfortable, possibly cutting off circulation, but letting go felt like abandonment, and he'd done sufficient abandoning for one lifetime. "I'm right here, not going anywhere. I promised, and I keep my promises when circumstances permit." The nurse, Jessica, according to her name tag along with credentials Garrett didn't have time to parse, started pushing the wheelchair toward triage. Garrett walked alongside, hands still locked with the woman's. Around them, the ER operated with efficient urgency. An elderly man clutched his chest in one corner, face gray with cardiac distress. A mother held a crying toddler whose arm bent wrong. A drunk slumped near vending machines, blood from a head laceration he'd apparently forgotten about. All the small tragedies comprising a Tuesday night in a city that never stopped breaking people creatively. A doctor emerged from an examination room late. 50s gray hair at the temples, eyes holding the particular exhaustion of someone who'd witnessed too much death, but kept fighting because the alternative meant admitting defeat. He glanced at the wheelchair, at Jessica's expression, and his stride shifted from routine to urgent. When he reached them, he knelt beside the woman with practiced efficiency. "When did the pain start? Can you describe the sensation and location for me?" The woman opened her mouth, but nothing emerged except a gasp indicating pain had moved past the point where verbal communication happened reliably. Garrett answered for her, falling into the medic's rhythm of report delivery, clear, concise, everything doctors needed and nothing they didn't. Discomfort visible since approximately 6 p.m. based on physical presentation when I first encountered her at the Belltown Grand Hotel. Severe pain by 8:30 based on her statements and physical reaction to palpation of the affected area. Right lower quadrant, primarily rigid abdomen. Obvious guarding behavior, rebound tenderness on examination. Tachycardia I'd estimate at 120 to 130 based on pulse check performed in the field. Diaphoretic cool extremities, declining mental status over approximately the past 20 minutes of transport time. No fever detected, but she's been standing in rain, so that reading would be unreliable. The doctor looked up at Garrett with an expression cycling rapidly through surprise, professional assessment, and something resembling dawning recognition. "You have medical training. You're presenting like someone who's done patient handoffs before, not a civilian bystander." "Army combat medic, 68 Whiskey MOS. Iraq and Afghanistan deployments spanning 2006 to 2014, 3 tours total. I've seen enough appendicitis cases to recognize the presentation. And I know what happens when people delay treatment past the point of surgical intervention being straightforward." Something shifted in the doctor's face, professional evaluation giving way to something more personal and complicated. He stood slowly still, studying Garrett's features like solving a puzzle that shouldn't exist in this context. And when he spoke, his voice had changed to something softer, weighted with memory. "I know you." Not a question, a statement carrying 3 years of accumulated weight. "Olivia Sullivan, 3 years ago this December. You're her husband. You're the man who tried to break down the operating room door while we were calling the code on your wife." The emergency room noise faded to white static. Garrett's world collapsed to the doctor's face and the name tag confirming what his gut already knew. Dr. Thomas Brennan, the doctor who'd tried to save Olivia, who'd performed chest compressions and administered medications while machines screamed warnings and time ran out on everything that mattered. The man who'd looked Garrett in the eye afterward and said, "I'm sorry we were 6 minutes too late starting the surgery," but never finished explaining what those 6 minutes might have purchased. "You told me you were 6 minutes too late. 6 minutes separated my wife living from dying, and we landed on the wrong side of that margin." Garrett heard his own voice from somewhere distant, detached, narrating someone else's tragedy. "I've calculated those 6 minutes every day since. What would have happened if I'd brought her in earlier? If traffic had been lighter? If I'd been less respectful of her stated preferences and more willing to override her fear of medical facilities?" Dr. Brennan's jaw tightened and his hands, which had been steady moments ago, developed visible tremor. "I tried everything. Every protocol, every intervention, every procedure medical science recommends. When someone presents with ruptured appendix and developing septic shock, I wish—" He stopped, swallowed whatever he'd been formulating, started over. "I'm profoundly sorry. I think about that case more frequently than professional detachment probably recommends. I review what I could have done differently with the information available at the time." The apology hung between them, inadequate and necessary. The kind of words that couldn't repair anything but needed expression anyway, because silence created its own damage. Garrett looked at this man who'd failed to save his wife, who likely carried that failure the way Garrett carried his own version, and understood with sudden clarity that blame was a knife cutting multiple directions until everyone involved bled identically. Tonight we're not too late. Garrett's grip tightened on the woman's hand. Tonight we have time surplus instead of deficit. Tonight 6 minutes doesn't determine whether someone lives or dies, because we're starting with margin for error. Something passed between them, understanding or forgiveness or simply shared determination from two men who'd lost one fight and refused to lose another. Dr. Brennan nodded once with sharp decisiveness, then turned to Jessica with command voice. Get her to examination room 3 immediately. Call surgery and inform them we have likely appendicitis, probably advanced given symptom timeline and presentation. I want labs drawn, imaging ordered, IV started with fluids running wide open. Move now. This is the type of case that kills patients when we prioritize thoroughness over speed. They wheeled the woman toward the examination room. She twisted in the chair, trying to maintain visual contact with Garrett, hand reaching back with desperation of someone watching their lifeline disappear. Brennan raised a hand, stopping the wheelchair's progress, then looked at Garrett with expression communicating he understood about lifelines and consequences of releasing them prematurely. You brought her in time, Sullivan. That earns you more than waiting room chairs and vending machine coffee. He gestured toward the examination room. 5 minutes before we need to work unimpeded. At least you'll know she arrived while we still had options available. Garrett followed them into the small room with sterile walls and beeping monitors, and the smell triggering every PTSD landmine his brain had carefully buried across 3 years of avoiding this building. This room, or one architecturally identical, they all looked the same, designed by people who'd never experienced them as anything except medical professionals, was where Olivia had died. Where machines had recorded her final heartbeat and doctors had called time of death at 9:47 p.m. And his world had ended in antiseptic efficiency. His hands shook, vision blurred at edges, monitor sounds became the flatline haunting his sleep. The woman in the bed grabbed his hand, pulling him back from panic's edge, and when he looked at her, he saw someone fighting identical battle against identical enemy. Thank you. She whispered it like prayer or confession. Thank you for not listening when I said I couldn't go. Thank you for being braver than I was capable of being tonight. Garrett squeezed her hand, felt her pulse, evidence of life continuing despite fear's attempts to end it. Thank you for trusting me enough to thank you for being brave enough to let someone help when every instinct said refuse. Dr. Brennan moved into action, hands steady again, years of practice superseding emotion. He examined her with quick efficiency, asked questions, receiving gasped answers. Jessica returned with another nurse, Sandra, according to her name tag, and they started an IV with practiced coordination of people who'd worked together until full sentences became unnecessary. They drew blood, spoke in medical shorthand, moved with urgent efficiency. Garrett backed toward the door, providing space to work, but the woman's gaze followed him with intensity of someone afraid that looking away meant he'd disappear. You're going to surgery, Dr. Brennan's voice carried calm authority. Appendicitis definitely, and we need surgical intervention before rupture if it hasn't occurred already. You're fortunate. Another hour, maybe 2, and we'd be discussing very different prognosis and complication risks. The woman nodded. Garrett saw the exact moment relief and terror collided in her expression. Alive but facing surgery. Safe but confronting what she'd feared 29 years. Winning and losing simultaneously. They wheeled her toward surgical wing. Garrett followed to double doors marked authorized personnel only, with small windows showing hallway beyond where he couldn't follow. The woman looked back once. He raised his hand in what he hoped resembled reassurance rather than goodbye. Then she was gone, and Garrett stood alone in a hallway smelling like death and disinfectant, heart hammering. And for the first time in 3 years, he'd walked through doors that terrified him and survived the experience. He found the waiting room on autopilot muscle memory from 3 years ago, guiding him to plastic chairs that had witnessed his wife's death. He collapsed into a seat that squeaked and pulled out his phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The text to Mrs. Kowalski took 3 attempts because his fingers wouldn't hit correct keys. Emergency at hospital. Tell Bryn I love her. Explain everything tomorrow. Response came in seconds, all capitals. Oh no, are you okay? What happened? He stared at the question, wondering how to explain he was sitting where his wife died, having just carried a stranger through doors he'd avoided for 3 years, and felt simultaneously more alive and more terrified than any moment since Olivia's funeral. Working on it, he typed back. The waiting room filled and emptied in waves. A young couple with a baby crying the cry that said something was seriously wrong. An old man insisting to his wife in 3 languages that he was fine and didn't need to be here. A teenager with a skateboard and wrong-angled arm who seemed more annoyed than injured. An hour passed with particular slowness only hospital waiting rooms seemed capable of generating. Garrett's phone buzzed text from Bryn. Mrs. Kowalski must have told her something despite his request to wait. Dad, are you okay? Call me, please. He typed carefully, choosing words that would reassure without lying because Bryn had developed supernatural ability to detect lies even through text. I'm okay, kiddo. Helped someone very sick tonight. Got her to hospital in time. Tell you about it tomorrow when I'm home. Love you more than anything. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again while Bryn typed and deleted and typed. Finally, love you too. Be safe. Mrs. K says you're being brave again. Garrett closed his eyes, leaned against the wall, and for the first time since Olivia died, prayed to whatever might be listening to broken men in hospital waiting rooms. Not for himself, he'd abandoned praying for things like forgiveness or peace or emotional comfort, reserved for people who hadn't failed as catastrophically. Just that the woman whose name he still didn't know would survive the next few hours. That Dr. Brennan would be 6 minutes early this time. That when morning came, someone would walk out of surgery alive. Overhead speakers paged doctors and called codes in the particular language of medical emergencies Garrett had learned to fear during Olivia's final hours. Every time footsteps approached, he tensed, waiting for the doctor in scrubs who'd delivered news about his wife, waiting to hear he'd failed again. But footsteps always passed. Codes were never for her. Time crawled forward with reluctant momentum. Dr. Brennan appeared 2 hours and 17 minutes later, still in scrub's surgical cap, crumpled in one hand, looking exhausted in ways that spoke of mental and physical effort pushed to limits. Garrett stood so fast his chair skidded backward with sound that made everyone look up then away when they realized the news wasn't for them. The doctor's face gave nothing away until he was close enough for privacy, then he smiled, small, tired, genuine. Acute appendicitis. Severely inflamed, but we extracted it before perforation. Another hour, maybe 2, and she'd have been in septic shock. Full-blown crisis instead of manageable emergency. You saved her life, Sullivan. If you'd waited for that ambulance, if you'd given her the choice to refuse treatment. He didn't finish because they both knew the ending. Garrett sat down hard, buried his face in his hands. 3 years of guilt crashed over him, all the what-ifs and should-haves and if-onlys. But underneath the guilt, something else stirred. Something resembling redemption, if redemption could be earned through getting it right the second time. Can I see her? Dr. Brennan nodded slowly. She's in recovery, coming out of anesthesia, but asking for you every time she surfaces enough to form words. I'm bending rules here, Sullivan. You're not family, not next of kin, not on any list authorizing recovery room access. He paused. But you brought her in when no one else would. You saved her life when the alternative was preserving her autonomy unto death. That counts for something substantial in my assessment. They walked through corridors, triggering memories Garrett would have paid to forget. The smell of antiseptic that would forever mean death in his internal lexicon. Beeping monitors while people in scrubs tried to keep hearts beating long enough for medicine to work. 3 years ago, he'd walked these halls behind a gurney carrying Olivia's body covered with a sheet. And every step had felt like walking on broken glass. Tonight felt different. Tonight he walked towards someone alive because he'd refused to let fear make decisions. Dr. Brennan paused outside recovery. "Sullivan, I need you to know something before you go in. Your wife, Olivia. I think about her every time appendicitis comes through those doors. I was 6 minutes too late starting surgery because I misread initial presentation and ordered tests that consumed time we didn't have. It wasn't your fault." Garrett surprised himself by meaning it, by believing it, possibly for the first time since that night. "She should have come in hours earlier when pain started. I should have made her come instead of respecting her fear. We both failed her differently. But tonight we didn't fail. Tonight we got it right." Something in Dr. Brennan's expression eased some burden lifting that Garrett recognized because he carried his own version. They stood in the hallway where someone lived because two men who'd failed once refused to fail twice. Dr. Brennan opened the door. The woman lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller, diminished by IV lines and monitors and pale hospital gowns stripping away armor money bought. But her eyes were open clear. When she saw Garrett, tears spilled down her cheeks. "You stayed." The words came out rough from intubation. Garrett crossed to her bedside, pulled up the plastic visitor's chair, sat. "I promised." She looked around the recovery room with something like wonder. "This is it. The room I've been scared of my whole adult life since I was 9 years old. It's just—" She laughed, caught between crying and something lighter. "It's just a room with beeping machines and aesthetically questionable tile work. And you conquered it." Garrett found himself smiling despite exhaustion. "You walked right through the door you swore you'd never walk through again. You carried me through it." She reached for his hand. "I would have died in that parking lot choosing death over facing this place. Why did you do it? You don't even know my name." Garrett looked at her hand in his, thought about Olivia's hand, going cold while he begged her to hold on. "Because someone should have done it for my wife. Because I know what it's like to lose someone to fear. And because tonight saving your life helped save a piece of mine too." Her face crumpled. She cried with force of relief, meeting gratitude, meeting 3 years of fear finally proven surmountable. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, more vulnerable. "My mother died in a hospital like this when I was 9. Catherine Ashford. She went in for what they said was routine surgery. I sat in the waiting room coloring pictures while doctors tried to save her. They couldn't." The confession tumbled out. "I walked out of here without her and swore I'd never come back. Spent 29 years building a life where I'd never have to. Made millions. Controlled everything. Convinced myself that power meant immunity from biology." Garrett understood building lives around trauma, around promises made to dead people. "My wife Olivia told me her stomach hurt. I gave her Advil. She didn't want to miss our daughter's school play. By the time we got here, her appendix had ruptured. She coded in the waiting room while I sat 20 feet away doing nothing productive. They sat in silence, two people who'd lost the same fight in different ways, bound by shared trauma and improbable survival. Around them, the hospital hummed with constant activity, nurses checking vitals machines, recording heartbeats, the eternal background noise of people fighting death incrementally. "What's your daughter's name?" The question came quietly. "Bryn. She's 13. Draws pictures of my van with angel wings and thinks I can fix anything despite substantial evidence to the contrary." Garrett pulled out his phone, showed her the lock screen, Bryn grinning at the camera, metal braces catching light, holding up her latest sketch. "She's the reason I kept going after Olivia died. The reason I'm sitting here instead of having given up on everything 3 years ago." The woman studied the photo with expression, holding longing and sadness and something Garrett couldn't identify. "She's lucky to have you as her father. I'm the lucky one. She makes me want to be the person she thinks I am, someone who saves people, someone who doesn't let fear win when courage matters. You are that person. You saved me when I'd given up on being saved. You walked through doors that terrified you because I needed you to." Her voice caught. "That's the bravest thing anyone's ever done for me in 29 years of building walls to ensure I'd never need anyone to be brave on my behalf." Garrett wanted to argue, wanted to explain he was just a mechanic who'd gotten lucky, who'd happened to be in the right place when the universe decided to offer him a second chance at getting things right. But looking at her face alive, healing victorious over fear that had controlled her for nearly 3 decades, he understood that maybe bravery wasn't about feeling fearless. Maybe it was about being terrified and moving forward anyway, because the alternative was letting fear kill people you could save. "Get some rest." He stood, every muscle suddenly remembering the last 18 hours. "Doctor says you'll be here a few days minimum for observation and recovery. I should probably go. Bryn's waiting up despite it being well past reasonable bedtime, and I need to tell her why her dad spent the night at the hospital. That still gives him nightmares." Panic flashed across the woman's face, quick and genuine. "Will you come back tomorrow? I know that's asking a lot given your work schedule and the fact that I'm essentially a stranger who's already disrupted your entire evening, but I—" She stopped, swallowed, tried again with visible effort. "I don't want to be alone in here, not yet, not until I'm certain the fear won't come back stronger when you're not here to remind me that this place can save lives instead of only taking them." Garrett thought about his schedule, about repair jobs waiting and bills accumulating and all the practical reasons to decline. Then he thought about Olivia dying alone while he sat in a waiting room, and the answer became obvious despite its inconvenience. "I'll be here. Afternoon probably works best given morning appointments, but I'll figure it out and text you once I—" He stopped, realized the absurdity. "I don't have your number or your name beyond woman I carried into the hospital. Natalie." She said it like testing the word in this context. "Natalie Ashford. And I should probably mention that I own Ashford Properties, which does commercial real estate development and has 17 buildings across Seattle. But right now, that all seems considerably less important than the fact that you saved my life in a parking lot because you refused to let fear make decisions for either of us." Garrett Sullivan. "I fix cars for living and try to keep my daughter from realizing how completely I'm making everything up as I go along." He smiled, and it didn't feel forced. "Nice to meet you, Natalie Ashford. Sorry about the dramatic circumstances of our introduction." "Best dramatic circumstances I've ever been part of." She was already drowsing, medication and exhaustion pulling her towards sleep. "See you tomorrow, Garrett Sullivan." He left her sleeping, walked back through hallways that no longer felt like they were actively trying to kill him, and stepped out of St. Catherine Hospital into rain that had gentled to drizzle. The van sat in the ambulance bay where he'd left it, and somewhere security was probably writing tickets, but Garrett didn't care. He'd survived the hospital. He'd saved a life. He'd walked through doors that had felt impassable and come out the other side still standing. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and empty roads and the particular silence that came after surviving something you'd been certain would destroy you. His apartment building rose against Seattle's skyline like it always had, modest, slightly shabby home in all the ways that mattered. Mrs. Kowalski met him in the hallway, her face creased with worry that eased when she saw him intact. "Bryn's been up every 10 minutes asking about you. I told her you were helping someone, that you were safe, but you know how she worries after—" She stopped herself, didn't finish the sentence because they both knew how it ended. Garrett knew. Bryn had been 10 when Olivia died, old enough to understand death and young enough to fear it, taking her remaining parent. Every late night, every missed call, every time he was 30 seconds late picking her up from school. He saw the fear flicker across her face, the terror that she'd wake up tomorrow an orphan. He found Bryn in her bed, surrounded by drawings, still awake despite the hour. She looked up when he entered, and relief crashed across her face in waves visible enough to break his heart. "Dad." She launched herself at him, and he caught her the way he always had, wrapping her in arms that remembered when she'd been small enough to carry everywhere. "Mrs. Kowalski said you were at the hospital. I thought I was scared that—" "I'm okay, kiddo." Garrett held her tight, breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the cherry lip gloss she'd started wearing since turning 13. I helped someone tonight, a woman who was very sick. Got her to the hospital in time for doctors to fix what was wrong. Bryn pulled back, studying his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read emotions like meteorologists read weather patterns. Like Mom. Was she sick like Mom was sick? The question hit harder than Garrett had anticipated. He sat on the edge of her bed, took her hands in his, and gave her the truth she deserved, even though it hurt to say. Exactly like Mom, same sickness, same symptoms, same everything, but this time I got her there fast enough. This time the doctors had time to save her instead of... He stopped. Couldn't finish that sentence. Tears filled Bryn's eyes, and Garrett realized she was crying for the mother she'd lost and the stranger she'd never meet. And maybe for the father who'd been carrying stones in his pockets for 3 years. She buried her face in his shoulder, and he held her while she cried the kind of tears that needed release. I'm proud of you, Dad. Her voice came out muffled against his shirt. You were so brave. You went back to the place that gives you nightmares and you saved someone. That's like superhero-level brave. Garrett thought about standing frozen in the hospital doorway, about carrying Natalie through doors that terrified them both, about Dr. Brennan's face when he said, You saved her life. Thought about redemption coming in forms you didn't expect, and second chances appearing when you'd stopped believing in them. We were both brave tonight, he said quietly. Sometimes that's all you can do when you're scared. Be scared and do it anyway because someone needs you to. Being brave doesn't mean you're not terrified. It means you're terrified, but you walk through the door because the person you're helping needs you more than you need to feel safe. He tucked Bryn back into bed, kissed her forehead, turned off the light, but left the door cracked the way she liked since Olivia died. In his own room, Garrett looked at the photo on his nightstand. Olivia on their wedding day, young and beautiful and alive in ways that didn't translate to pixels but lived in memory anyway. He picked up the frame, ran his thumb across her face, and spoke to her the way he did some nights when the silence got too loud and sleeping felt impossible. I didn't let her wait live. I didn't make your mistake. Dr. Brennan said I saved her life and I... His voice cracked, but he pushed through. I wish I'd saved yours. I wish I'd been strong enough to override your fear 3 years ago. But tonight I made sure someone else got a second chance. Tonight I made sure someone else's kid doesn't grow up asking why their mom didn't come home even though she doesn't have kids. Tonight I got it right. He set the frame down carefully, lay on the bed that still felt too big after 3 years of sleeping alone, and closed his eyes. Sleep came without dreams for the first time in months, no nightmares about hospitals or flatlines or Olivia's face asking why he didn't save her. Just darkness and rest and the quiet satisfaction of having walked through doors that terrified him and survived the experience. When morning broke over Seattle with the tentative light that characterized Pacific Northwest autumn, Garrett woke feeling like maybe, just maybe, he'd started paying down a debt he'd thought would define him until he died. The weight on his chest hadn't disappeared. Guilt that profound didn't evaporate overnight, but it had shifted slightly, made room for something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. 4 weeks separated Garrett from returning to St. Catherine Hospital, and he spent most of those weeks finding increasingly creative reasons to postpone the inevitable. The garage demanded constant attention in ways that felt both legitimate and convenient. 3 new commercial clients requiring detailed service contracts, equipment purchases that needed research and vendor negotiations. West training David Martinez, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood the particular language of slunts that combat veterans spoke fluently. Revenue projections exceeded expectations by 40%, which meant hiring a professional accountant to handle books that had grown beyond what spreadsheets could track reliably. Success should have felt like unambiguous victory, like validation for risks that had seemed insane 6 months ago. Instead, it felt like standing on ground that might collapse if he stopped moving long enough for the earth to notice his weight. Natalie wrestled her own collection of demons during those same 4 weeks, and her demons had been collecting interest for considerably longer than Garrett's. Her therapist increased sessions from once weekly to twice, working methodically through decades of hospital-related trauma that one successful surgery hadn't magically erased, despite Natalie's initial optimism that facing her fear once would cure it permanently. She'd wake at 3 a.m. in her penthouse bed, or increasingly often in Garrett's apartment smelling antiseptic that wasn't there. Hearing machines beep in rhythms her sleeping brain invented from memory and terror, reliving the night her mother died in loops that felt more visceral and real than whatever present moment she was actually occupying. The gala represented voluntary return to the precise source of that trauma, choosing to relive publicly the worst night of her adult life in front of 200 strangers whose only job was to judge whether her fear and vulnerability were entertaining enough to inspire them to open their checkbooks and donate substantial money to a cause. They met at Garrett's apartment one Thursday evening to write speeches that neither of them wanted to write, but both understood were necessary if they were going to follow through on the commitment they'd made to Dr. Brennan and to the principle that their trauma could serve some useful purpose beyond destroying them individually. Bryn studied at the kitchen table, headphones in, and homework spread across every available surface, while Garrett and Natalie worked in the living room with laptops open and blank documents staring at them accusingly. Natalie's first draft read like a corporate presentation she'd deliver to a board of directors, clinical language. Emotional distance carefully maintained, designed to impress with competence, rather than connect with human beings experiencing human emotions. Facts about her mother's death delivered chronologically, statistics about hospital avoidance behaviors in the general population, business metrics showing how fear of medical intervention costs the economy billions annually in preventable deaths and delayed treatment. Professional, polished, completely devoid of anything that might actually move someone to feel something genuine. Garrett's first draft read like an incident report he'd file with commanding officers after a casualty event, timeline of Olivia's symptoms, documentation of decisions made and not made, factual recitation of outcomes, without acknowledging the emotional devastation those outcomes had caused. Wife experienced abdominal pain at 1600 hours. Pain medication administered. Symptoms worsened by 20-30 hours. Transport to hospital initiated at 2115 hours. Patient expired at 2147 hours. Cause of death: ruptured appendix, septic shock, delayed treatment. Report submitted by someone who'd learned that feeling things too intensely made them impossible to survive. They traded drafts in silence, heavy with mutual recognition, read what the other had written with growing understanding that they were both doing the same thing, hiding behind professionalism and clinical distance, because vulnerability felt too dangerous to risk in front of strangers who held no obligation to treat their pain gently. When Natalie looked up from reading Garrett's draft, her eyes held the same realization he'd had reading hers. "This is terrible." She gestured at both screens. "Mine reads like I'm trying to sell commercial real estate to hospital administrators. Yours reads like you're reporting enemy casualties to people who don't actually care whether those casualties had names or families or dreams that died with them." Garrett closed his laptop with deliberate finality. "We're both doing the same thing, protecting ourselves from having to actually feel this in public. But people don't donate money because speakers maintained impressive professional composure and emotional distance throughout their presentations. They donate because someone made them feel something real enough that opening their checkbook feels like the only adequate response to the magnitude of what they've just witnessed." "I can't talk about my mother's death without crying." Natalie stared at her hands, unwilling to meet his eyes while confessing this particular weakness. "Can't describe that hallway when I was 9 years old, those sounds the machines made, the doctor kneeling down to my level to tell a child her mother wasn't coming back. If I start crying on stage in front of 200 people who came expecting polished speeches about charitable giving, then you cry and let them see it." Garrett reached across the small space between them on the couch, covered her hand with his. Let them see you break down talking about the worst thing that ever happened to you. Let them see me break down talking about how I failed my wife. That's what they need to see if we want them to understand why this matters enough to fund an emergency room renovation. Bryn looked up from her homework with the particular intensity of teenagers who'd learned to read rooms better than most adults managed despite decades more practice. She pulled out her headphones with deliberate slowness. You should tell them about me too, about how I ask why Mom didn't come home, and you have to explain that being scared of hospitals killed her faster than being sick did. About why you carried Natalie into the place that gives you nightmares because you couldn't save Mom, but you could save someone else if you were brave enough to try. The observation landed with the particular weight of truth delivered by people too young to have learned the comfortable lies that adults constructed to make uncomfortable realities easier to live with. Garrett met his daughter's eyes across the small apartment that felt even smaller when it contained this much accumulated pain. And he saw wisdom that 13-year-olds shouldn't possess, but often did when they'd spent formative years watching their surviving parent carry grief like stones in deep pockets. You're right. He acknowledged it simply because arguing with Bryn when she was right accomplished nothing except making her more determined. Both of you are right. We write new speeches, honest ones that hurt to say but need saying anyway because that's the entire point of doing this in the first place. They worked for 3 more hours, Bryn occasionally offering brutal teenage honesty about which parts sounded fake and which parts sounded like they actually meant something. By the time they finished, both speeches were raw enough to draw blood from anyone listening with adequate attention and empathy. Natalie's speech told the story of 9-year-old Catherine sitting in a waiting room coloring pictures while her mother died behind doors. She couldn't see past swearing never to return to a place that took the only person she trusted completely. Garrett's speech walked through every decision he'd made and not made the night Olivia died, every moment he'd chosen to respect her autonomy instead of overriding her fear, every second he'd wasted while time ran out on saving her life. Neither speech was comfortable to read even silently. Speaking them aloud in front of 200 strangers was going to feel like voluntary emotional dismemberment performed for public entertainment. The night before the gala, Garrett lay in bed beside Natalie, who'd stayed over despite maintaining the increasingly transparent fiction that she still lived primarily in her penthouse. And he listened to Seattle rain hammer against windows while wondering whether courage was a finite resource that depleted with use, or some kind of renewable energy that strengthened through practice. He'd walked through St. Catherine's doors once 6 months ago, terrified but propelled forward by necessity and moral obligation to save someone who would die without intervention. Walking through them again tomorrow felt qualitatively different, chosen rather than compelled performance, rather than emergency response, public vulnerability rather than private terror, witnessed only by people with professional obligations to maintain his privacy. His phone lit up at midnight with a text from Natalie, despite her being right beside him in bed. Can't sleep, keep seeing my mother's face, keep hearing those machines, tell me this gets easier with practice or at least less terrifying with repetition. Garrett typed back immediately despite knowing his response wouldn't bring the comfort she was seeking. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at being scared while still moving forward anyway. See you tomorrow when we voluntarily do the scariest thing either of us has done since that parking lot. Her response came 30 seconds later. That's not comforting in any meaningful way, and I suspect you know that. Wasn't trying to comfort. Was trying to be honest because honesty feels more important than comfort when we're both lying awake terrified at midnight. I hate that you're completely right about that. Also, I hate that I'm texting you while lying next to you instead of just talking like a normal person. Welcome to modern relationships. It's weird here and nobody warned us adequately about the protocols. The exchange carried them both towards something resembling rest, if not actual sleep, finding small comfort in shared misery and mutual acknowledgement that fear didn't magically disappear just because you'd successfully faced it once. Morning arrived with the particular inevitability of deadlines that don't negotiate or care about your emotional readiness for the events they're requiring you to participate in. Garrett stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 7 a.m., already dressed in the suit he'd bought for Olivia's funeral 3 years ago and hadn't worn since because wearing it felt like admitting death was permanent in ways he'd spent considerable time and energy denying. The reflection showed someone who looked marginally capable of public speaking and felt entirely like an imposter, wearing his own skin badly buttons fastened wrong on the first attempt and requiring complete restart. Mrs. Kowalski found him fumbling with his tie at 8:30, 20 minutes before he needed to leave to pick up Natalie. And she stepped in with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd raised 4 sons and buried 2 husbands and understood without explanation that sometimes fully grown men needed help with simple tasks. When complex emotions made simple things feel impossible to execute correctly. Olivia would be proud of what you're doing today. She straightened the knot with hands that remembered how ties worked considerably better than Garrett's currently did. I'm proud of you too, and I never even met your wife, so my pride is based entirely on watching you survive 3 years of grief and come out the other side mostly intact and raising that daughter of yours beautifully. Now go tell those rich people why hospitals matter and why they should give substantial amounts of money to make hospitals less terrifying for people who've spent entire lifetimes avoiding them. Garrett drove to Natalie's building in his van because arriving at a formal gala in the Tesla felt like lying about who they were at their fundamental core. She waited outside wearing an evening gown that probably cost more than Garrett earned in 3 months, hairstyled with professional precision makeup applied with considerable skill that couldn't quite hide the fear evident in her eyes when she saw him pull up. She climbed into the passenger seat with the careful movements of someone wearing uncomfortable shoes and carrying even more uncomfortable emotional baggage. We're really doing this? Not a question. A statement acknowledging the reality they were about to walk into voluntarily despite every instinct screaming that retreat was the sensible option. We're really doing this. Garrett put the van in gear, pulled into morning traffic that seemed oblivious to the magnitude of what they were facing. Still time to bail and drive to Canada to start new lives as fishing guides who never have to make speeches about trauma or face hospitals or interact with rich people who expect polish we don't possess. Tempting proposition that I've genuinely considered multiple times this morning. She touched Bryn's drawing, still taped to the dashboard after 6 months, traced the improbable wings their daughter had added to make an ordinary van magical. But your daughter believes in you with faith that doesn't require evidence beyond what she's directly observed over 13 years. That faith is worth more than running away from fear, even though running away sounds extremely attractive right now. They drove in silence through streets that led inevitably toward St. Catherine Hospital, both processing what returning meant in ways that extended far beyond the speeches they'd written and memorized and practiced, until words felt like weapons they'd be deploying against themselves in front of an audience paid to watch. The building appeared ahead with its red emergency room sign glowing against gray Seattle morning sky, and Garrett's chest tightened with familiar panic, suggesting his PTSD had only been dormant rather than cured by 6 months of gradual healing. Natalie's hand found his on the gear shift before he'd consciously registered, reaching for comfort held tight enough to hurt, and he found himself grateful for the pain. Because pain meant present tense rather than past, meant now rather than 3 years ago, meant moving forward instead of trapped in memory. Together. Her voice shook with audible effort to maintain control. We walk through those doors together exactly like we did 6 months ago. Except this time nobody's actively dying, and we're choosing this instead of having it forced on us by medical emergency. The grand ballroom had been transformed from clinical hospital space to high-end fundraising venue with the efficiency that suggested the hospital employed people who staged elaborate events professionally and frequently. White linen tablecloths draped tables arranged in careful geometry, centerpieces featuring flowers. That probably cost more than Garrett's monthly rent payment dominated each surface. 200 seats filled with donors wearing their net worth visibly on their wrists and around their necks, and in the precise cut of their designer clothes that announced wealth without requiring vulgar discussion of actual dollar amounts. A stage dominated one wall of the ballroom, featuring a microphone and podium and professional lighting designed to make speakers look important and authoritative even when speakers felt fraudulent and terrified. Garrett's stomach lurched with the particular nausea that accompanied contemplating public speaking. The kind of visceral dread that made facing enemy fire in Fallujah seem straightforward by comparison, because at least enemy fire didn't require emotional vulnerability performed for entertainment purposes. Dr. Brennan found them near the entrance, relief washing across his face, with the transparency of someone who genuinely worried their keynote speakers might flee at the last possible moment. He'd aged visibly since their last encounter 6 months ago, more gray threading through his hair, deeper lines carved around his eyes and mouth. The accumulated weight of people saved and people lost, pressing down on his shoulders until standing fully upright required conscious effort rather than happening automatically. "You actually came." He shook Garrett's hand with both of his own gratitude evident in grip strength and duration. "I wasn't completely certain you would, given what I'm asking you to relive publicly for charitable purposes that benefit strangers. Thank you, both of you. What you're doing today, your story, matters more than you probably realize." Natalie's carefully maintained composure developed visible cracks under the weight of mounting anticipation. "We haven't actually given the speeches yet, Dr. Brennan. I'd recommend reserving gratitude and praise until after we've either inspired significant generosity or embarrassed ourselves publicly in ways that make you regret this invitation. Either outcome remains entirely possible at this point in the day. You could stand up there and read the phone book verbatim for 20 minutes and people would still donate substantially because your mere presence here demonstrates more raw courage than most of them have shown in their entire comfortable lives." Dr. Brennan gestured toward the ballroom with invitation. "There's a cocktail hour first for networking and donor cultivation, then dinner for basic sustenance, then your speeches for the emotional manipulation that inspires people to open checkbooks for causes that moved them. Try not to vomit on stage if possible. It's genuinely terrible for the carpet and the custodial staff lodges formal complaints." The attempt at levity helped marginally. They entered the ballroom together, navigating through clusters of wealthy donors who recognized Natalie from various business dealings and looked at Garrett with the undisguised curiosity typically reserved for exotic animals displayed outside their natural habitat. Class difference manifested in 1,000 small ways that compounded into overwhelming evidence that Garrett didn't belong. Conversations casually referencing summer homes in locations he couldn't afford to visit even for weekends, charity boards he'd never be invited to join regardless of qualifications, business dealings, routinely measured in amounts that made his annual income look like rounding errors in quarterly reports. Garrett endured 45 minutes of awkward small talk that felt like performance art before his peripheral vision caught a figure across the crowded ballroom that stopped both his heart and breathing simultaneously. 62 years old, gray hair cut efficiently short in a style suggesting practicality over aesthetic concerns, posture speaking of strength earned through surviving experiences that should have destroyed you emotionally if not physically. Diane Sullivan, Olivia's mother, Bryn's grandmother. The woman who had blamed Garrett explicitly for her daughter's preventable death at the funeral 3 years ago, and hadn't spoken a single word to him since that terrible day when they'd buried Olivia together while Bryn cried between them asking questions. Neither adult could answer without breaking down completely. Recognition happened simultaneously on both sides with the speed of people who'd once constituted family and remained connected through shared grief even when that connection had become impossible to maintain. Through anger and blame, Diane's face cycled rapidly through shock pain, something that resembled hope, fighting with fear of hope, expressions changing faster than Garrett could adequately catalog them. He froze with every carefully rehearsed social skill evaporating instantly, leaving him standing in formal wear, feeling like he'd been caught trespassing somewhere he had absolutely no right to be. Natalie sensed the shift immediately with the awareness of someone who'd learned to read his emotional states, across 6 months of intensive partnership. What's wrong? You look like you've just seen a ghost or encountered someone you're genuinely terrified of seeing here. Olivia's mother. The words came out flat, in effect stripped by panic, suggesting this reunion could only end badly for everyone involved. Diane Sullivan. She's apparently here as a donor. She hasn't spoken to me since Olivia's funeral, when she told me in front of multiple witnesses that her daughter's death was fundamentally my fault for not forcing her to seek medical treatment earlier, despite her stated preferences. Diane crossed the ballroom with evident purpose, suggesting retreat wasn't an option she'd considered or would permit. Up close, she looked considerably older than Garrett's memory of her, from the funeral worn down by grief that aged people from inside out, in ways that expensive cosmetics couldn't hide and plastic surgery couldn't repair. Her eyes held Olivia's distinctive shape, but none of her warmth replaced by something harder and more brittle, suggesting protective armor constructed from accumulated pain. Garrett. His name emerged tentatively from her mouth, testing whether speaking to him directly would cause immediate pain for both parties or just one. I didn't know you would be here tonight as a speaker. Dr. Brennan didn't mention specific names when he invited me to attend as a donor, and I didn't think to ask for the full program because I make substantial donations to this hospital regardless of who's speaking. Dr. Brennan asked us to share our story publicly. Garrett gestured somewhat helplessly at Natalie beside him at the ballroom, surrounding them at circumstances that had conspired to bring them together in ways neither had chosen or anticipated. About what happened 6 months ago in that parking lot. About second chances and facing fears and convincing people to donate money by making them feel uncomfortable emotions. Diane's assessing gaze shifted to Natalie, with evaluation happening at speed, suggesting decades of practice rapidly judging people's character and intentions. You're the woman he saved from dying, the appendicitis case I read about in the news coverage, the business partnership afterward, Second Chance Garage. Natalie Ashford. She extended her hand with the practiced confidence that came from years of high-stakes business negotiations, where showing any weakness meant losing substantial advantage. Your former son-in-law saved my life when I'd essentially given up on being saved. He's a genuinely remarkable human being who deserves considerably better than carrying guilt for circumstances that were largely beyond his control. Something fundamental cracked in Diane's carefully maintained expression. Defensive armor showing stress fractures, suggesting it had been held in place through continuous effort that was finally becoming unsustainable after 3 years of constant maintenance. He was my son-in-law once. I honestly don't know what our relationship is now after 3 years of deliberate silence and blame distributed carelessly in directions it probably didn't belong. Her voice broke in ways suggesting she'd been mentally rehearsing this exact conversation for years, without opportunity to actually have it. I was profoundly wrong to say those things at Olivia's funeral. Wrong to blame you for her death when you were grieving as deeply as I was. Wrong to cut you completely out of my life. Wrong to miss 3 consecutive years of my only granddaughter growing up because I couldn't face my own failure as a mother who taught her daughter to fear vulnerability more than death itself. Garrett's throat closed with emotion that 3 years of regular therapy sessions hadn't fully processed or resolved adequately. The apology landed considerably harder than the accusations had 3 years ago, carrying weight of genuine regret that matched his own guilt in ways that made mutual blame feel like something they'd both been using to avoid confronting more complicated feelings about systemic failure that extended beyond any single person's decisions. You weren't wrong about everything you said. Garrett forced the words past resistance. I should have recognized what was happening earlier. Should have made Olivia go to the hospital when symptoms first appeared instead of respecting her stated preference to avoid medical intervention. Should have been stronger when strength would have directly saved her life instead of weak when weakness killed her. She was absolutely terrified of doctors and hospitals and admitting she couldn't handle everything through sheer willpower alone. Diane spoke over him with urgency, suggesting she'd been waiting literally years to deliver these specific words. I raised her to be strong, to never show vulnerability to anyone, to handle absolutely everything herself, because depending on others meant accepting risk of abandonment. I taught her the fear that killed her more certainly than appendicitis or septic shock did. If anyone fundamentally failed Olivia, it was me for instilling values that prioritized independence over survival. The confession hung heavy between them in air, weighted with 3 years of carefully maintained mutual blame, finally spoken aloud in a ballroom full of strangers who had absolutely no idea they were witnessing reconciliation that had seemed impossible until it started actually happening. Natalie's hand found Garrett's with silent support while he navigated emotional terrain that possessed no map and no clear destination beyond possibly something resembling peace, if peace was even achievable after accumulating this much pain. Bryn asks about you constantly. Garrett forced each word past the substantial lump forming in his throat. Every single week, without exception, she asks why her grandmother stopped visiting after her mother died. She fundamentally doesn't understand why you disappeared precisely when she needed family most desperately. She thinks she did something wrong to drive you away permanently. Tears formed in Diane's eyes faster than she could blink them away. Genuine emotion breaking decisively through control she'd maintained through visible effort. I was deeply ashamed of myself for blaming you so publicly. Ashamed of how I'd catastrophically failed as a mother to Olivia by teaching her fear instead of courage. Ashamed that I couldn't look at Bryn without seeing Olivia and breaking apart completely every single time. But standing here now, seeing you moving forward with your life and this woman beside you, maybe I can try to do the same thing instead of staying frozen in grief that helps absolutely nobody. Come to dinner this week. The invitation emerged before Garrett's brain had adequate time to evaluate whether extending it constituted a good idea or a disaster waiting to unfold. Bryn would be overjoyed to see you. We would both genuinely love to have you back in our lives if you're willing to try again despite 3 years of absence. Diane nodded while crying too hard to speak coherently. Natalie produced tissues from somewhere. Apparently evening gowns came equipped with emergency supplies for emotional occasions, and offered them with compassion clearly born from personal understanding that crying in public required immediate logistical support. The 3 of them stood in a corner of the ballroom processing reconciliation too fragile to trust completely, but too necessary to abandon, while wealthy donors mingled around them in complete oblivious ignorance that healing was actively happening in their immediate presence. The CEO's tedious financial presentation dragged through statistics about emergency response times and patient outcomes, and the $17 million renovation requiring substantial philanthropic support to complete on the ambitious schedule. Garrett sat at a table near the stage with appetite completely destroyed by mounting nerves that made successful digestion seem wildly optimistic at best. Natalie picked without enthusiasm at food that probably cost $50 per plate and tasted like expensive cardboard according to what little she managed to force down. Diane had strategically taken a seat 3 tables away, close enough to offer visible silent support but sufficiently far to provide space they might need. Dr. Brennan finally took the stage after dessert plates were efficiently cleared with the precision of events planned meticulously to the minute. The audience quieted with the practiced discipline of people thoroughly accustomed to charity galas where attention functioned as currency purchased with donations that bought naming rights and social capital. Garrett's heart hammered loudly enough he worried the sensitive microphone would somehow pick up the sound when his turn came. Natalie's hand found his under the table, both gripping desperately like they were falling, and each other represented the only available handhold preventing complete collapse into void. Tonight I want to introduce 2 genuinely extraordinary people who lived the exact crisis our emergency room was specifically designed to handle. Dr. Brennan's voice carried hard-earned authority. 6 months ago, Garrett Sullivan carried a dying woman through doors that terrified them both considerably more than death itself did. That woman, Natalie Ashford, survived because someone finally refused to let fear make decisions that biology would inevitably punish fatally. Their story represents everything we're attempting to achieve with this renovation, saving lives by making emergency care genuinely accessible and substantially less frightening to people who've spent entire lifetimes systematically avoiding it. Please welcome Garrett Sullivan and Natalie Ashford. Sustained applause filled the ballroom with the particular sound of 200 affluent people clapping politely while waiting to be adequately convinced their continued attention was worth giving. Garrett stood on legs that felt borrowed from someone considerably more capable, crossed to the stage with Natalie providing essential moral support through proximity alone, and faced an audience clearly expecting entertainment or inspiration, or both, skillfully disguised as charitable fundraising appeal. Natalie spoke first, having deliberately stripped away all corporate polish through conscious decision to tell unvarnished truth instead of performing carefully rehearsed story. 29 years ago, my mother, Catherine Ashford, went into a hospital for what multiple doctors explicitly assured us was completely routine surgery with minimal risk. I was 9 years old. I sat in the waiting room and colored pictures while doctors desperately tried to save her life using every tool and technique available to them. They couldn't, despite genuine best efforts and considerable skill. I walked out without her that day, and I swore with every ounce of conviction a 9-year-old could muster that I would never willingly enter a hospital again as long as I lived, regardless of what happened to me medically. Her voice caught but held through obvious visible effort. The ballroom had gone profoundly silent in the particular way that happens when people collectively sense they're witnessing something genuine rather than performed. Natalie gripped the podium with both hands until knuckles turned white from pressure, physically forcing herself forward through fear that desperately wanted her to stop talking and run from the stage and the memories and everything this moment demanded. I spent exactly 29 years systematically building a life where I would never require medical care or depend on anyone for anything meaningful. I made millions of dollars. I controlled virtually everything within my considerable sphere of influence. I convinced myself through repeated success that power and accumulated wealth meant functional immunity from biology and uncontrollable circumstances. 6 months ago, I learned with brutal clarity exactly how catastrophically wrong I'd been about absolutely everything when my appendix ruptured and I found myself dying in a parking lot. Even while actively dying, I adamantly refused to seek hospital treatment. I was literally willing to die rather than face the specific place that took my mother from me. Tears started falling, but she deliberately didn't wipe them away, allowing vulnerability to display itself in ways that made the entire audience lean forward with attention that money genuinely couldn't purchase. Garrett Sullivan didn't accept my refusal to seek necessary help. He physically picked me up, carried me to his work van, and drove me directly to this hospital, despite both of us being absolutely terrified of these specific doors and everything they represented in our respective personal histories. He saved my life, not because he knew me personally or expected any form of compensation, but because his wife had died 3 years ago from the exact same condition that was actively killing me. And he'd been too afraid to override her fear when overriding it would have directly saved her life. When faced with me, he chose differently despite it costing him everything emotionally to make that choice. She looked directly at Garrett with clear invitation that communicated your turn, and he stepped to the microphone feeling like his legs might give out completely before he finished even the first sentence. The audience waited with patience, suggesting Natalie's raw story had moved them enough to give him substantial benefit of doubt, even though public speaking clearly wasn't his natural strength. I'm genuinely not good with formal speeches or polished presentations. His voice emerged rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by emotion he'd tried unsuccessfully to contain. I fix engines for a living, not people, but 3 years ago I learned through devastating experience that sometimes the broken things you can't fix matter infinitely more than the ones you can, and that lesson destroyed my life in ways I'm still actively processing. He gripped the podium to steady hands that wanted desperately to shake. My wife Olivia told me one afternoon that her stomach hurt. I gave her over-the-counter pain medication and suggested rest. She didn't want to miss our daughter's school play that evening because she'd made a promise to attend. and she was fundamentally someone who kept promises even when keeping them caused her physical pain. By the time I finally brought her to this specific hospital, her appendix had completely ruptured. She died in the waiting room while I sat approximately 20 feet away, doing absolutely nothing productive. The admission landed in the ballroom like a physical presence, causing people to shift uncomfortably in seats that suddenly felt considerably less comfortable. Someone in the audience made a small, involuntary sound of sympathy that others quickly moved to slants. Garrett forced himself to continue because stopping now meant wasting everyone's time, including his own. I have a daughter, Bryn. She's 13 years old now. She was only 10 when Olivia died. Every single night for 3 consecutive years. She's asked me why mommy didn't come home. And every single night I've had to explain that sometimes being scared of the right thing is infinitely more dangerous than being scared of the wrong thing. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. Olivia was scared of hospitals and doctors and admitting she needed help she couldn't provide for herself. I was scared of making her do something she explicitly didn't want to do because I thought being a good husband meant respecting her choices even when those choices terrified me. Our combined fears worked together to kill her while we both watched it happen. He found Dr. Brennan in the front row, saw the doctor's face carrying its own substantial guilt. 6 months ago, I was in a parking lot and I heard a woman say the exact words my wife had said. I can't go to the hospital. And something in me either broke or healed. I'm still not entirely sure which, but I absolutely refuse to let history repeat itself with different characters but the same tragic ending. I carried Natalie through the same doors I'd carried Olivia through 3 years earlier. But this time we weren't too late. This time we got it right. Tears flowed freely, but he continued. My daughter thinks I'm brave. She draws pictures of my work van with angel wings and tells people her dad fixes broken things even though I couldn't fix the most important thing that ever broke. Tonight I'm standing here because we walked through doors that terrified us both. We survived, and in surviving we learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're absolutely terrified, but you walk through the door anyway because the person you love needs you to. Natalie returned for closing. Tonight I'm pledging $500,000 to this emergency room renovation. But more important than money, I'm pledging to tell this story wherever people will listen. If my story saves even one person from dying in a parking lot, because fear convinced them giving up was safer, then that horrible night becomes the most important night of my life. Standing ovation erupted. 200 people rising, sustained applause thundering through acoustically excellent ballroom. Dr. Brennan joined them on stage. 3 years ago, I failed to save Olivia Sullivan. Tonight, I'm here because her husband refused to let me fail twice. Donations $4.7 million. Thank you. The evening blurred through gratitude and handshakes. Diane approached as crowds thinned. Olivia would be proud. I'm proud. Dinner this week. Outside at 11 p.m., they sat on a bench near the entrance. Same doors 6 months ago. We did it again, chose to come back. Dr. Brennan said we saved lives tonight. They sat watching Seattle exist around them. Garrett's phone buzzed text from Bryn. You were on TV, everyone at school will freak out. Love you, Dad. 1 year compressed Second Chance Garage to 8 locations, 60 employees. Natalie's company debt-free. Garrett's medical debt cleared, framed on his wall. Weekly dinners with Diane. Bryn 14 portfolio ready. 6 months after the gala, Garrett carried the ring for 3 weeks. Discovery Park. Overlooking Puget Sound. Rain. A year ago, I carried you into a hospital. 6 months ago, we told strangers our stories. 3 months ago, you moved in. Last week, Bryn asked when you're officially becoming her second mother. Garrett, I'm not over Olivia. You're still healing. He pulled out the ring, simple, honest. Will you marry me? Sign up for complicated, trust me. She laughed through tears. Worst proposal ever, yes. Ring fit perfectly. Bryn had traced one while Natalie slept. Bryn knew, immediately launched into planning. Diane cried happy tears. 6 months later. Second chance garage wedding. 40 guests. Diane front row. Bryn maid of honor tool belt with flowers. Dr. Brennan officiated. I've seen them at their worst, watched them become each other's strength. Vows exchanged. Simple, honest, tearful. Married beginning. 3 years more, 8 locations, debt-free house purchased. Bryn, 18, Art Center College accepted. One evening, porch sunset. Bryn packing. Diane inside. Bryn leaves soon. Or I'm pregnant, 8 weeks. Garrett pulled her close. Olivia would be happy. Bryn emerged. You told him I've known 3 weeks. Diane joined. A baby. 4 becoming 5, watching stars. Email from Dr. Brennan. 10,000th patient, 10,000 lives, thank you. We saved people by being honest. Inside to daughter leaving, grandmother returned, baby coming. Garage fixing things, ER saving lives, and somewhere in Seattle people chose courage, chose help, chose future, believed second chances existed if brave enough. Wings became real, word count 6,500.